Okay, I'll just let the attendees filter in. Good morning, everyone, as you join us. Just give it one more minute. Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Alina Vazanen, and I work with the Community Initiatives team at the Canadian Women's Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar, Resetting Normal, an intersectional analysis of the speech from the throne. We're so happy that you're here. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available afterwards. So before we get started today, I do want to note that today is Orange Shirt Day. It's a day to honor the experiences of thousands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit residential school survivors. It's also a time to acknowledge the loss of Indigenous children who did not make it home. So furthermore, I'd like to acknowledge that the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and the organizations that we support and work with, that work takes place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. So we are grateful for the opportunity to meet and to work on this land, but we have to recognize that land acknowledgements like this one I'm making right now are not enough. In all that we do, we need to make sure that we are pursuing truth and reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. And that's in an ongoing effort to make right with our relations. So next, I'm just going to cover some technical housekeeping details. So if you haven't already, at the bottom of your screen, there is an interpretation option. So if you could please select a language. At the bottom, you'll see where it says interpretation. So the interpreters are working today to make sure that everybody can hear. So even if you are hearing me now, please select English or French to make sure that it is a seamless experience. I'll note that we will be taking audience questions for the speakers today at the end of the presentation. So please make sure that if you have a question that comes up, to type it in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. Just like all online meetings, if we have technical issues, I promise we'll work to get them resolved as soon as we can and as quickly as possible. So just be patient if anything comes up. And finally, at the end of the webinar, you'll see a post-event survey. So if you can, please give us your feedback. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator, Ann Dector. Sorry, Ann. Now, I'll just say a few words. I'll just say we're so lucky to have Ann Dector as a senior director at the Canadian Women's Foundation. She's an advocate, researcher, writer, and publisher, and she focuses on advancing equality for all women. And recently, she's been working very tirelessly on our Resetting Normal reports. So thank you, Ann.
Thanks, Alina. Hi, and welcome to our intersectional discussion of last week's speech from the throne, which outlined the government's priorities from now till the end of the fiscal year, March 31st, 2021. I'm here with Katherine Scott from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and Pamela Uppal from the Ontario Nonprofit Network. Along with Faye Faraday, Pamela and Katherine generously worked with us on the paper Resetting Normal, Women, Decent Work in Canada's Fractured Care Economy, which we released in early summer. We'll begin with Katherine and Pamela setting the context for this conversation and for the throne speech, and followed by a presenter discussion, and then time for your questions. As Alina mentioned, you can submit questions using the question and answer function at any time during the webinar. First, introductions. Katherine Scott is a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and director of CCPA's Gender Equality and Public Policy Work. She blogs regularly on Behind the Numbers, where she's been sharing analysis of the gendered and ethno-racial economic impacts of the pandemic for the last 6 months, and we'll hear more about that today from her. Pamela Uppal is a policy advisor at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, who is leading ONN's Future of Work initiative with a nonprofit and gender-based intersectional lens, as well as their Decent Work for Women project. Her work over the past 10 years has focused on creating gender equitable systems by bridging frontline work, research initiatives, and policy advocacy, and she brings a rich analysis of care work in Canada to today's conversation. We'll begin with Katherine. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Hope everyone can hear. This is great. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to come together with Anne and Pamela and Karen, the whole team at the Canadian Women's Foundation. It's just been a really valuable partnership these past number of months, sharing our perspectives on the evolution of obviously the pandemic and its impact on women's economic security, and in particular, as we're going to focus on the care economy, it's just been a tremendous challenge and a tremendous opportunity. So thank you so much to the Foundation, certainly for hosting this webinar. I've been struck, and I just want to say off the top that I'll be zooming through a few of the slides, sort of giving an update on where we are with recovery from a gender perspective, and certainly and touch obviously on the speech from the throne. And if people want to follow up with me individually around some of the data that I'll be presenting, I'm more than happy to share that and the data and the tables that are underlying that and distribute them through to you directly, or I guess through the Foundation. So thanks again. No surprise to anyone that women have been hugely impacted by the pandemic, certainly in their roles as essential workers and among those who've lost employment and had their hours cut back significantly and now are sitting on the sidelines of the recovery. I think the pandemic, as we all know, certainly demonstrated how economically and precariously many Canadians are and the service on which we rely, certainly after 30 years of austerity and privatization. And it's also exposed the systemic undervaluing of paid and unpaid work. And that's certainly reflected most graphically in the poor working conditions of care providers we're seeing today, the concentration of infections in neighborhoods where a large number of precarious frontline workers reside. It's all that data out of Toronto recently, as well as the offloading of this highly skilled work to low-paid racialized migrant workers. Governments have been reluctant to act, even in the face of desperate need, expecting households and women in particular to shoulder this massive increase in unpaid labor that we've seen these past number of months. Certainly this last month with school reopening has been chaotic, to be polite about it. And absent significant investment in care and education, women and mothers are dropping out of the labor force or scaling back their involvement significantly, putting aside their own financial security in order to stick handle the demands of the pandemic. First slide. We're already seeing this, certainly in the recent economic data and employment data out of StatsCan. Months after the onset of the crisis and the start of our recovery like this past spring, women's employment lags men's, and their economic security remains really fragile. By August, women had recouped about 2/3 of their employment February to April employment losses, but most of that job growth was actually in part-time work. And on the key metric of full-time employment, women have recouped less than half of these job losses. The next slide. Employment gains have been particularly weak, predictably, particularly weak among moms with kids under 12. Certainly by August, fathers of children had effectively gotten back to zero, had recouped all of their losses, but 12% of the mothers who were working in February were still without work or working less than half of their hours. And on this score, next slide, lone parents, and this is extraordinary really to look at this bottom line at the bottom, but lone parents, of course, are experiencing the greatest losses of employment and hours as compared to moms or parents in couple families. And they're certainly recovering much more slowly. This chart looks at the percentage of those who are without work or working less than half their hours by month. Obviously, it's reported in the labor force survey. And you can see certainly just the trajectory of each of these. We're looking at men and women families and with couple families. This is mothers with kids under 12 by the type, whether they're in a couple family or lone parent. You can see on the bottom that lone parent families are lagging significantly in terms of their recovery. Fully 29% of all lone parents with kids under 12 are still unemployed or working less than half their hours, and that actually is a much higher, 42% of all moms with kids at lone parents under 6 are in this situation. And as we know, next slide, the families that were most at risk going into this pandemic certainly are those most at risk for being left behind in the recovery. Losses have been particularly high, for instance, among recent immigrants, who a result certainly of their larger concentration in areas of the economy, low wage work, short tenured jobs. As well, new data from StatsCan has just started releasing this past July, shows that unemployment certainly is much higher among racialized women as compared to non-racialized or non-Indigenous women. You can see that at the very bottom where you see the comparison of the unemployment rate, which are the gray bars, and the green bars are their employment rate. So you can see the difference here between these two groups reported this past month. And of course, this varies by the group, the racialized group to which women belong. And of course, on this score, women who identify as Arab and women who identify as Black have rates of unemployment that are twice as high as non-racialized, non-Indigenous women. So the speech from what's needed clearly, just quickly going through where we're at with the recovery, is a clear analysis and a clear plan going forward. Certainly, I believe strongly this is the moment to revitalize our social infrastructure and to create a system of high quality care and publicly managed caring services that reach all Canadians across the country, and to build a truly comprehensive income security system. So did the speech from the throne deliver? So next slide. Next slide. There are certainly several key announcements, and I'll go through these quickly, and this will be, we can take these up in the context of the discussion afterwards. Several initiatives obviously were announced that are essential to women's economic recovery and their future security. Most significantly, the government has signaled its intent to, quote, make significant and long-term sustained investments to create a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. They've also promised, and this is exciting, to create a new action plan for women and the economy to drive a whole of government intersectional approach to the pandemic and recovery. They have signaled that they will, quote, continue to advance, whatever that means, let's hope it's good, the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence, and of course, as critically important, the calls to justice coming out from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, recognizing, of course, the tremendously heightened risk of violence that thousands of women, girls, trans, and non-binary people are experiencing right now during the pandemic. We have governments promised as well to work on a new set of national standards for long-term care and to further provide targeted measures to support PSWs, including those undocumented and refugee workers who've helped out tirelessly in the long-term care sector, certainly Ontario and Quebec this past spring. We know as well they're promising to take further action on homelessness and make further investments in the national housing strategy, which is critically important as well. And I hope we'll circle back to this. They're promising to bring forward a disability inclusion plan, including a new Canadian disability benefit modeled on the GIS. And certainly not least, but they have again promised to bring forward different actions, proposals to address systemic racism against racialized communities and Indigenous peoples. Certainly, for instance, promising to bring in legislation to implement UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, by the end of this year. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of these initiatives and certainly the hope that they portend for a transformative change. Certainly the new disability benefit would actually touch the lives of millions. But, and I do think that many of these proposals certainly highlight the differential impacts or the intersectional impacts of the pandemic and the shutdown. But of course, it all hinges on the what comes next, the program details and the funding resources that we are expecting in the economic response plan that's coming out later this fall. So these are sort of hinting at where the government hopes to go. But again, the devil is in the details and we don't know those yet or what kind of budgets they're attaching. I'm going to skip forward a bit. I've got some more research or information on the benefits the government has proposed, but I'm conscious of the time, and maybe we can pick that up in the discussion about the transition to surge. So I'll just finish here and segue over to Pamela to say the thing that I'm concerned about now, and it was an odd, you read this speech from the throne, and it would, always struck by the quality of the writers, these folks mobilized, but there was really an odd sense of lack of urgency about the speech from the throne. I thought it hit, and as I said, many of the right targets, but it really did miss a sense of urgency at the moment, and certainly the threats that I believe that attacks from the extreme right and inaction on the part of governments really represent at this time. For me, what's extraordinarily telling is the pending closure of thousands of childcare centers should be capturing all of our attention. Yet many are standing by while this critical infrastructure collapses, with the clear expectation that somehow families and moms in particular are going to step in to take up this work. We've got new protocols and guidelines, for instance, that have been rolled out by provincial governments the last few months, but yet little attention paid to what's needed to protect largely racialized workers in part-time and temporary employment. And that actually was missing in the speech from the throne. Obviously the people most impacted by the economic downturn right now. And in fact, not only standing by, but deriding calls for greater attention to systemic racism and intersecting forms of discrimination. Jason Kenney this past week called intersectional feminist recovery plan kooky academic theory. And for me, what's absolutely bizarre and kooky is how could you possibly begin to develop a recovery plan without understanding the magnitude and the impacts of the crisis on those most impacted? I mean, that's, beyond. So I do believe what's needed now is a heightened sense of urgency to tackle these challenges that we're going to lay out and hopefully discuss later on. It's a bit of a blueprint, the speech from the throne, but it will obviously contain much strides on the resources in our own activism to make these potential changes reality. So I'm hoping to pass it on to my colleague Pamela to hear from her perspective from the ONM.
Thank you, Katherine. And just wanted to echo what you had opened with. It's been a pleasure working with both CCPA and the Foundation on care work, the care economy, and being able to do that in such a short amount of time and share so much information with the sector. So that's been a great experience. And so I just wanted to set some context around what do we mean by care work and the care economy. I just wanted to also note that in the last provincial election in Ontario, when Katherine Wynne was running against her opponent, her platform was called Care. Care was all like, I think 1,000, 2,000 times written in her platform. That was the title of her platform. But at that point, the public narrative we have around care work and care economy just did not exist like it does today. And that's something that I wanted to highlight coming out of going into COVID, coming out of COVID, going into the recovery, the way in which that term has sort of become a buzzword, or some very positive connotations have been added to it, are really, really important to push forward some of the gender equity work we've been focusing on, and advocates before me have been focusing on for decades. So just to begin with, in terms of what I mean by care work and how we've sort of conceptualized it in our work, we've borrowed from the International Labour Organization. And what we really mean is that care work consists of activities and relations involved in meeting the physical, psychological, and emotional needs of adult, children, people with disabilities, the old, the young, the frail, able-bodied. It can be both, be unpaid or unpaid work, and takes place in a variety of settings. So if we look at care work on a spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, we'll have that direct care, face-to-face activities. So we're thinking, long-term care, health care, child care, those kind of pieces fit into that part. If we go all the way onto the other side of the spectrum, that's when we're looking at indirect care activities. So these are all the caring pieces that go in for sustaining people and homes and workers, domestic labor activities, anything around reproducing and maintaining. So cooking, cleaning, managing household. One way to look at it from the labor force perspective is that people can go work 9 to 5 because there's a whole care mechanism behind them, which is usually unpaid. In the middle of the spectrum are both indirect and direct activities. And this is more of that emotional labor that we hear a lot about, that predominantly falls onto women. Managing relationships, managing communities, checking in with people. I mean, again, if we look at it from the workplace, who's doing the birthday cards and the showers and who's putting all that together. So it's really activities that further the development and transmission of knowledge, of community well-being, social values, cultural practices, all that sort of thing. And all of these pieces are essential to community well-being. I mean, one of the other things that we've seen coming out of, or sort of within COVID and the pandemic, has been the need for social connection, the need to be with other people. And when that doesn't exist, the impact on our mental health. So in short, care work is a substance of what is involved in reproducing and maintaining our population on a daily and a generational basis. It's critical for the functioning of our economy and society. In Canada, the state, which would be our government, market, so we're looking at for-profit, community organizations, and households, sort of all provide deliver care in some way or form. And this has shifted over time. As we've seen the rise and the fall of the welfare state, we saw the government take more of a role. We've seen more recently a growing presence of for-profits in delivering care, and I'm particularly referring to childcare and long-term care, where the big box long-term care centers and childcare centers are taking over and growing. We've seen community organizations delivering gender-based violence services, disability services, community living, shelters, transitional homes, all that sort of stuff. And we know the precarious footing that they sit on. And then when, over time and the shifts in responsibility, households are expected to pick up the slack. So that's another space in which that happens. So, if you can't find childcare, then you should, have grandparents or in-laws or someone at home to take care of that. If you can't do that, then, predominantly women end up staying home and taking care of kids, which is something that we've seen during this pandemic. And really want to underscore that the people behind care work, racialized, immigrant, and migrant women. Those are the ones that are predominantly delivering care, whether it's public, private, or whichever space it's in, paid or unpaid, and also are sort of the ones holding up the economy. And because, they're the majority of those workers are doing that work, but also because care work is considered, women's work, also considered that of particularly racialized immigrant and migrant women's work, it's low waged and low valued. And putting all this together, we see a fractured care sector and a care economy in Canada. More recently, there's been shifts. I just wanted to highlight this. If anyone follows Women's Budget Group from the UK, they've been just doing such amazing work around care work, care economy. And they've sort of put out this new way of looking at it. Well, not new, but a new term, a caring economy, and saying that it means acting together to improve well-being rather than to maximize economic growth, and that a caring economy centers people and planet. Next slide, please. And I won't spend too much time on this because I'm sure everyone knows this. We've been hearing about this. The pandemic has really highlighted how important care work is and the care economy is to our health and well-being, including pandemic control. So even if we don't look at childcare and long-term care and those pieces, but we look at grocery store clerks, cleaning, all of that, it's been super, super essential. But it's also really brought to the forefront, and this was the narrative shift piece I was referring to, how it's low valued and low wage, the low social value attached to it. And this goes back to particularly who's working in those sectors, who works in the care economy, how their work is valued. And so really looking at, again, considering it as women's work, that of racialized immigrant and migrant workers, and thus it being low wage to low valued, considered unskilled labor, and then decent work or lack of wages sort of dropping down. We saw care work being highlighted, both paid and care work. So I just talked about paid, but we saw the triple burden on women, the unpaid care work that they had to take on at home. So working, managing a household, and being caregivers if they had someone sick or children at home. Just wanted to highlight that one of the policy responses that happened during the pandemic before we moved into a sort of recovery phase was pandemic pay, which was particularly around this, right? Realizing that their care work is so low valued and low wage that the government had to institute sort of a pandemic pay, increasing pay temporarily for particular frontline workers, because why would they risk their lives for less than minimum wage? Right? Next slide, please. And so when Katherine, Ann, and I and Faye Faraday were working on our Resetting Normal paper around care work, care economy, we really thought about what do we need for care work to be sustainable over time and valued fairly. So we've seen this narrative shift. Sort of the argument is accepted and made that care work is important and it underpins our economy, but how do we move to that being translated into it being sustainable over time and keeping that value over time as well? Like I said, pandemic pay was temporary until August. There's no pandemic pay anymore. So we were looking to the throne speech for these commitments: decent work for care workers, significant investments in social infrastructure, and taking profit out of care. So these were actually the recommendations we had put in our report. And as we've been following the recovery conversations, this is what we've been looking for. In terms of what I mean for decent work for care workers is really making sure wages, social protections, labor protections are there. Usually the care workers are the ones that are at the bottom of the wage grid, precarious employment, not stable, lack of benefits. So really raising the floor for women, particularly racialized and immigrant women who work in this, decent work is really important. Significant investments in social infrastructure. So, we'll get into this. We saw a little bit about this, but it was really investing in long-term care, childcare, investing in all these care services and delivery, these services, care services that are delivered to particularly support women workers, right? They're green jobs, they create more jobs in investing in physical infrastructure, and particularly impact women who are overwhelming majority in those sectors, plus create a better social safety net for the community. And when we talk about raising the floor or putting into place mechanisms for care workers, it actually raises the floor for everyone and sort of creates better communities for everyone. And the last piece I'll just touch on is taking profit out of care. We saw what happened with long-term care. We've seen what's happened with childcare. Both of these places have many for-profit enterprises delivering that care, and quality is sacrificed. Decent work is sacrificed for profit. And so we were looking for commitments from the feds to see how we can make that go away, eliminate, profit being the center and switching to more people and planet based in delivering care services. And yes, go ahead, Anne.
Okay, so thank you very much to you both. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to contextualize the rest of the discussion. You've drawn a picture of who's experiencing the heaviest economic impacts of the pandemic and of pandemic response measures, and also of the state of care work in Canada, all of which signals the strong need for an intersectional response. So the first question before us, really in relation to the speech from the throne, is, do the announcements that are in that frame an intersectional response? Is it possible through what the government said that they're going to concentrate that will respond to the gendered and racialized impacts of the pandemic? And I guess supplementary on that is do they center as much of the work that's come out of the women's sector and out of feminist recovery suggestions, plans, documents, that these need to center the most marginalized women in Canada to be successful? So welcome your conversation on those points.
Sure, I'll start. As I suggested in my comments, I think that the speech from the throne certainly alludes to several critical issues that are fundamental to women's rights and advancing gender equality, trying to protect against the rollback. They touch certainly childcare, a variety of things. I do think they allude to these, but the question is, in a document like this, the challenge is that they're, really don't have particular the plans are not attached to them. So, you know, we'll have to see what this, for instance, this Women in the Economy task force shapes up to be. Certainly my hope and hope for that initiative will be that it is representative of a broad constituency within the women's community and in the women's movement, and fundamentally employs an intersectional approach. On policy measures, I think, you know, and I'll come back to the disability benefit, because this is something that sort of, I think it does speak to the potential of this plan to really, to recognize certainly the position of people with disabilities and the fundamental abject poverty many, you know, millions, hundreds of thousands of people live in. And I think this benefit does have the potential to be transformative. Right now, disability benefits across the country are a complete patchwork, totally depends on where you live, what type of disability you have, how you got that disability, whether it's what your workplace status is, do you have access to employment? I mean, it's, you know, it's a totally complex, and it's patently unfair. And it forces hundreds of thousands of people, growing numbers of people, to rely on social assistance. So I do believe, for instance, a new disability benefit that would augment incomes would be critically important, and it fundamentally touches, you know, 1 in 4 women actually report a disability in Canada. So I do think that is a very exciting development. But again, as I said, it's like childcare, like the promise to take a distinction-based approach to Indigenous social and health services, which is critical. It will depend on what comes next.
Pamela?
Yeah, you know, just sort of touching on what Katherine had said in the beginning around, you always wonder who's written the speech, right? Because what I found with the speech was it hit all the buzzwords. It hit, you know, it felt like I was reading something that was from my Twitter page, right? I'm following all these great activists and advocates and who've been talking about these things since March, since April, and all of those buzzwords and who it's impacted were all put in there. But just like Katherine said, you know, you always wonder, so how is this going to play out? How is this actually going to happen? And how is it going to happen with a minority government? And how is it going to happen when you have the feds making promises about things that sometimes can be in provincial jurisdictions, right? And I'm particularly referring to childcare, to really see how is that going to play out? How are you going to get 10 provinces and territories together to build this system? And that, needing that sense of urgency that, you know, Katherine was always talking about, how is that all going to happen? And so I'm just going to refer back to the 3 commitments we were looking for, which was decent work for care workers, social infrastructure investments, and also the last one was around taking profit out of care. Did we particularly see those? Not really. And those are the sectors in which most women work in, mostly racialized immigrant and migrant women work in, and historically and traditionally and to date. So what I would have been happy with, and what I think would have really, you know, impacted the most marginalized women worker or most marginalized women who wants to go into work is investments in those places, commitments to those 3 pieces in some ways. And we didn't really see that. We saw, you know, commitment to creating 1 million jobs, but we don't know how. We saw commitments to upskilling, retraining, all that kind of stuff, but nothing really, you know, what is that going to play out? How is that going to play out? And, you know, again, the rhetoric and the buzz and all of that's there. So, I mean, that's symbolic in of itself. So that's great. But we need some teeth behind what they've mentioned. And I won't go over what, you know, some of the same wins that Katherine has talked about, that promising childcare, action plan for women in the economy. There has been, you know, even when they talked about long-term care, it would have been great to see something around, so how are we going to deal with the profit piece when it comes to long-term care or even childcare? So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we have to wait to see what's going to happen in the fall. But I really do want to stress, you know, even if there are targeted measures for most marginalized women workers or most marginalized women, it doesn't mean that it's a pie. It doesn't mean that others aren't getting something. It just means that we're raising the floor for everyone.
Yes.
And when the most marginalized is supported, everyone is supported in this better community. And I was actually happy with EI modernization. I will say that. I think EI modernization has been advocates have been working for that for a number of years, to just, even if it's temporary, to see some of those qualification criteria drop down has been really good. And so, you know, that opens the window for us to make it permanent.
Yeah,
It's
lots of work
interesting.
ahead.
Yeah, and it's interesting how this moment of crisis has sort of brought forward things that many of us have been talking about, and many organizations have been talking about for a long time and asking for attention to, and suddenly they're on everyone's mind. They're in this speech. But I guess, you know, you both said, so the broad strokes are there. The announcements do open the door to the kind of change, or at least some of the kind of change that we're looking for. But what are your thoughts around what are the policies and programs that could realize the opportunities opened by the throne speech? So kind of what are your excuse me, key action items? And maybe also what can we do besides wait?
I can start this off.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, timelines, dollars, and implementation plans, like that's what was going through my head when I was first reading the throne speech, is what I would like to see next, or to know that these aren't just empty promises or commitments. And just particularly speaking from a nonprofit sector lens and coming from ONN, one of the key action items on our plate right now in reading the throne speech has been, how do we position nonprofit business models as a better way to deliver care services? And I'm not saying, you know, they're the best model and the only model, but it's really lit a fire for us to do that necessary evidence gathering and information and research, putting that together around, you know, how can nonprofit co-op childcare models be another option, a better option? Nonprofit childcare models, how can that be a better option? How can we position nonprofits and charities as better care service delivery partners? And so, and really highlighting, you know, we are mission driven, we put people at the center, we invest our profits back into our missions, back into our communities, and how can this model be not only great for delivering care services, but for local economic development, community well-being, community economic development pieces. So that's sort of some of the key action items for us. And really thinking about what are those advocacy moments or windows of opportunity, even if we're not the lead advocates in that. So employment insurance modernization is another example I'll share. I mean, there's amazing advocates out there who've been doing this work for years on modernization. So for us, it's about how do we amplify and support their messaging? How do we incorporate their messaging into any advocacy work that we're doing? How do we apply that nonprofit lens, since we are 80% women workers, to that? So EI matters to us. Maternity, parental leave benefits, regular benefits, caregiving benefits, all of those matter to our workers. And so how do we make sure we're supporting and amplifying their work? And keeping an eye out on those advocacy moments and windows, and doing a lot of coalition and networked policy work. And so again, we're not the only ones, so really reaching out to partners and others and supporting the work that they're doing and amplifying it. Yeah, I'll pause there, and then if you want to ask.
No, I completely agree. You know, this is the moment where, you know, certainly we've got the speech from the throne, and now the work begins. Like constantly now the work begins. Like there's not been a moment during this pandemic when people aren't scrambling, trying to wrap their heads around what actually is happening on the ground and what needs to be in place in terms of foundational shifts and changes to programs, like we were talking around, like actually putting in place a Canada-wide childcare program. Those are foundational, setting labor standards that lift everyone up by providing that floor that's critical. All of these income security reforms, and certainly, you know, there are many ideas, many players. It's ideas that are coalescing after years, whether it's on EI or childcare system or protections for migrant workers. You know, we've had some of these recommendations, and coalitions are moving. Like, you know, the Migrant Rights Network obviously has been hugely active on not only enumerating the conditions of migrant workers in the agricultural sector that have been so hugely impacted, but certainly migrant care workers who are, you know, care workers in our homes who have been so hugely locked in homes in very abusive, often abusive situations. Those, or like the mobilization behind the safe opening of schools, like here in Ontario. Ontario Safe is an advocacy organization that got off the ground. A single parent educator in Toronto got 250,000 signatures on her petition for safe reopening in smaller classes. So there's great energy that's mobilizing, and we have this sort of opening, as you said. So how do you direct and double down? Like childcare has to be the critical thing right now. Literally, you know, we're in the field right now, CCPA. with a survey of 10,000 childcare centers and homes across the country, and it's like a pandemic. It is. It's an apocalypse. Upwards of 50% are considering they'll be closed. And it's hard for me even to begin to understand the magnitude of that in terms of what that's going to mean for women's economic equality, all women, regardless of what piece you're in terms of what that's going to mean by way of driving the recovery forward, household incomes, levels of poverty. So, I think there's huge mobilization, and the question is like, what policy reforms are going to get driven through? And, I do think that there is a moment, certainly, and I'm going to say something else about that, but like at federally, we've seen changes this past week with the new floor on the recovery benefits that were proposed by the federal government with the coalition, and certainly the new provisions around sickness leave. The CCPA's research on how many people would be left behind, and the importance of how many people are worse off or better off or worse off or the same under those reviews, I think obviously had impact. It's kind of an extraordinary moment. The question is, how do we concretize? How do we start to build out our infrastructure such that these aren't temporary? The idea of a $2,000 a month benchmark, hugely important in the disability community, saying like, what the hell are we doing? Like 1,000 and change, like how is that tenable to going forward? So I think there's huge moment. I guess the last thing I'd say about this, and because, is that a lot of the focus, of course, has been federally, and, the provinces have been taking a pass on this. And I sit in Ontario, and I appreciate that it leaves one biased. But, I saw a figure somewhere. It's something like, of the pandemic spending or recovery spending, 91% has been federal, and 9% has been provincial. And recognizing those different orders of government have different, tools at their disposal to generate income and to employ it. A lot of provinces are taking a pass, and in fact are counterproductively working against efforts to get us forward. And the other, even in Ontario, where we had this wild disjuncture between what the government says it's doing and what actually is happening. Like workers have not received pandemic pay. They go on about it, but they actually haven't got the money, nor are PSWs employed full-time in long-term care. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, this huge disjuncture. So I do think some of the focus and attention has to be focused provincially about how this rolls out. So, and that's a caveat to what a positive, sort of somewhat positive take on the federal plan is.
So we have this sort of, go ahead.
And just wanted to add two things to that. One is this, the moment that, you're talking about, Katherine, is so important, because some of the arguments that we usually have to make the argument, then do the research, and then do the planning and the policy piece. So that argument, some of those arguments have been made. So I do think there's an opportunity to focus more on perhaps updating evidence and doing more of that policy and advocacy and network and coalition work, versus trying to make the argument why childcare matters. So I think that's something important to highlight. And then the other piece is, it's really interesting because if we look at direct care activities or direct care services, they're usually the province's jurisdiction, and they're delivered through provinces and then municipalities. So that interplay between the federal and the provincial government is really important, because let's say, the feds funnel all the money that they want, but if the provinces aren't transparent and accountable to it, we might never ever see it on the ground. And so then we've lost the moment. And so how do we sort of, do advocacy with two different types of governments at two different levels or three different levels at the same time, which is so difficult. And I really feel for the childcare folks, because that's what they've been doing, especially in Ontario, municipal government, provincial government, and federal government. It's really hard. It's so difficult.
But the childcare in particular has been pretty effective. We're looking at the biggest opportunity in a very long time, and sort of what we're seeing is that federally there's a lot of leverage with a minority government, and through this section so far of this sitting, it's been the NDP who have been agreeing to support if they can get the things they want, and we've seen proposals change over the course of a week, or even they're announced and then they're revised in that process. So there is leverage there, and there's movement, you're right, where the advocacy is. But then there's a whole other layer of trying to get the federal government to make the agreements with the provinces and territories in a way that will tie them to implementing what the federal government has promised. So those are really interesting points on how you do that multi-level activity. I think if there's anything more you want to add, we could do that, or otherwise it's time to hear from the listeners.
Yes,
And get to
absolutely.
their questions. So I will pass it over to Michelle and Alina, who are going to manage this part.
Thank you so much, Anne. So we've had some questions come in from the listeners that want to turn the spotlight on to violence. So the question is, understanding the government's commitment to the National Action Plan. What are your thoughts on the commitment to gender-based violence and prevention? And will there be an increased acknowledgement of how the pandemic is affecting gender-based violence and intimate partner violence?
Do you want to go?
Well, I can speak briefly to that. It's certainly our understanding, the government, certainly we've had this from the federal, Women and Gender Equality Canada. Obviously, the promise was initially in the Liberal promises back in the election period that they had committed to putting $30 million into development of a national action plan. Certainly, the national advocates have been pushing for many years for a national action plan and had redoubled their efforts and reissued the call. There has been engagement on this file, and certainly we're very happy to see the language in the speech from the throne. The department is just, at this juncture, I'm not sure, other people might have better intelligence, that it has not come yet. It hasn't come together. So it's on the agenda, but it hasn't come together. And the idea and the stress and the stress around this is that it not simply be like the gender-based violence strategy, which has done some terrific things, not least of which is putting critical money into research and some of the StatsCan surveys that are coming out and flowing money to shelters and other providers, but that we have a national action plan that's actually national, which means that it's federal, provincial, territorial, Indigenous government plan that coordinates at all levels, because it's a whole of government. If ever there was a whole of government issue, this is it. And so the concern, and not dissimilar from childcare, is yes, it's actually on the agenda, but what kind of plan will be forthcoming, and will it be comprehensive such that we can actually begin to reduce these appallingly high levels of violence that women and other gender-based and gender-diverse people are experiencing right now? So that's the critical moment. So I no further intelligence on what's happening, but it's certainly it's in the works.
Yes. I think we know it is in the works, like Women and Gender Equality, the federal department. They do have people writing, and they are in some kind of conversations with the national women's sector anti-violence organizations. What they will do with the input that Katherine and I have both been at meetings where we've heard the input given. How far they will take that, we don't know. But it is on the agenda. We just don't know what's going to come of it. So.
Thank you. So another common question we're sort of getting is asking if you would expand on how to build coalitions. So how do we reach out and build the coalitions at the local level and with bigger, more organized organizations? How does that work?
I can sort of take this. It's, people want to talk. I will say that. People definitely want to connect and share information. One of the things that we've been doing at ONN since, I guess, May at this point, was just bringing together childcare advocates and providers across Anglophone, Francophone, and Indigenous spaces, just bringing them together to convene and share information. They're all receiving different types of information from different sources, and so we just try to be the backbone in terms of connecting people, bringing them together, sharing information, so everybody's sort of on the same page, and we can develop some shared messages within our individual advocacy work. And a lot of I think coalition work is a lot of relationship building work. It's a lot of reaching out. It's a lot of, sending those cold emails, being like, hey, this is what I'm interested in, and you're doing this. We should chat and connect. And it takes time. And so we've been working on, especially on the childcare front for the last 4 months. And so actually now being very well positioned to do some of that childcare business models work because we built relationships across the childcare space in Ontario, and now more so at the federal or national level as well. But yeah, I think people are getting bits and pieces of information, bits and pieces of analysis, and the more we can do information sharing, talking to each other, coming together, and amplifying and supporting each other's messages, that's a good first step anyways.
I guess I would also say, like, as Pamela said, people want to talk. So if there's an organization that can play a convening role around a particular issue and bring people together, at the national level, there are, broad organizations working childcare, certainly violence against women. You have Women's Shelters Canada. Some places there isn't a lead role, kind of an organization, a lead organization. But then, to accomplish all of this, we do need the communication between like the national organizations working on childcare to the provincial organizations working on childcare. And I'd actually say that's probably one of the stronger areas. So there's also provincial shelter associations that have some strength. But it's really trying to convene and move across with that. And another thing I would say to remember is there's also academics around who are working on these issues, who may be willing and able to provide you with the kind of research that you need to be able to advocate. And then you also see like City for All Women and other, Women Transforming Cities in Vancouver that are working at the municipal level and can be working with the municipal governments. So for example, on housing, the National Housing Strategy, 25% of that is supposed to be targeted to women and girls, programs that serve women and girls. And a lot of that money is now flowing directly federal to municipal. So getting in there and talking to the municipal governments about how that's moving and getting your projects there is really key. So I don't know if that helps, but it is a lot of levels. There's a lot to do, but there's also a lot of organizations that can work together and build strength. They might be really small on your own, but working together, you can build strength.
You end up pooling resources, pooling experience and expertise, pooling risk, and coming out with better better materials or better advocacy work in that way. I mean, I think our Resetting Normal papers are such a great example, right?
That's what I was just going to say.
Has to be, and I think it's all about being collaborative and not being so mission driven in your own way, right? And so if I was the only one, if ONN was the only one talking about care work, no way our message would have been as powerful. But having 3 different organizations to work on a paper like this, and we're all saying the same thing in different ways, in different arenas, that makes the message more powerful.
And we have different capacities. So the foundation has a lot of capacity to convene and to push a message forward, but we don't have the research and knowledge strength that either CCPA or ONN does. So by working together, we could produce something that was more powerful.
Great, thank you. I recognize that we're running through time and we have a lot of questions coming through, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. The next question we had was about a particular part in the throne speech that mentioned penalizing those who neglect seniors under their care. What recourse is there to ensure that this doesn't unfairly impact women, and especially migrant or racialized women?
Yeah, that was one of the provisions. Actually, there are criminal prohibitions against neglect currently in criminal law. Like, just so we're clear, so you're left with the thought, is this something that they put in there specifically that, because it's such a critical issue right now, that is sort of, it's more signaling as opposed to something that's substantive. There is obviously, and there has been concern raised by the unions and those representing personal support workers and the like, whether the people that, you know, whether individual workers would be targeted through a law like this, as opposed to where the fault rightly or jointly lies, certainly with employers that persist and create these working conditions such that where these types of this neglect occurs. So that it's an imbalance. Hard to say how this will play out. I think the unions have been really persuasive on this, and I would hope that it's, you know, there's no legislation, you can't tell right now, but certainly the push is to target employers and institutions, and certainly the move to get profit out of care is all about redirecting resources and creating conditions of work that facilitate conditions of care. Pat Armstrong's been one of our research associates at CCPA, very clear on the international research on that, you know, tackling conditions of work, and that is absolutely fundamental to enhancing and improving care for residents. So hopefully it will not, that is a risk, and hopefully it won't play out that way.
Yeah, so the target for that is really the the commitment to leading national standards on long-term care, and to have the push go there rather than to criminalization of workers.
Yeah.
This might be our last question, and it's asking for advice on how would you talk specifically about certain provinces, and the example they use is Alberta, where there might be a push to invest in quote unquote real jobs rather than care jobs, considering the economic downturn they've gone through recently.
So, I mean, that's why the action plan for women's economic, I think they call it empowerment, is so important, and the people who feed into that, the people who are going to be tapped into. And one of the messages that I really want to push forward, and at ONN we are needing investments in sectors that women already are majority workers in, which are usually the care sectors, supporting those, as well as and alongside physical infrastructure projects, and also in those spaces in which women aren't traditionally in. So often I'm worried that what we might see, which often happens with women's economic justice sort of plans or policies from the government side, is let's push women into STEM and construction and trades, and then they'll just make more money and everything will be fixed. Which we know is not the path forward, or it can't be the only path forward. And so, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of breaking the narrative around what are real jobs, what are not real jobs, and how that's very feminized and masculinized. And that feeds back into why then care work is low waged and low valued. And so picking up on some of the arguments around why care work is important to communities, why it's important to how it sustains economies, how it allows people to do the work that they're doing, and how that's why it needs to be sort of invested in properly and valued fairly. Those arguments are really important. And so I'm really looking to the action plan that the Throne speech has mentioned, and making sure that we're able to influence what's in that action plan from that perspective.
You know, I don't think we can, you know, Alberta, I mean, there's you know, it's a significant challenge. You know, the current provincial government has been loath to has been actually hugely negligent in talking about actually women as employed. I saw some of their recovery plan came out. There wasn't even a picture of a woman in the entirety of the document. You know, it's just the absence of this and the perspective of the government. I don't underestimate the challenge that represents in terms of positioning, you know, provincial investment that would flow to, and in fact, you know, not only the challenge, but the cuts that are on the tables current, that were pre-pandemic, that were on, you know, slated to roll through health and social services in the province, including in childcare, the rollbacks. You know, you know, women are in different places in different parts of the country, and it reflects not only the provincial or the federal, but certainly the provincial government and the structure of the employment, labor market, and all of that, which remains why it's critically important that, you know, we work through vehicles like this to join advocacy, to generate the research that's necessary to the advocacy and to support workers on the ground to push these policies forward. I don't think women in Alberta will sit by while, you know, childcare collapses and their, you know, their labor market and incomes are driven down either. So you know, this is a moment to extend support across the country. Hopefully that we can support activism everywhere, because it does come back to the resources to push forward our alternatives and make it happen.
If there's any lesson from the pandemic that's clearer than the fact that care work is real work and saves lives, I don't know what it is really. So I think that is all the time we have for today. It's we're just coming up on 2 o'clock. I want to give a huge thank you to Pamela and Katherine, not just for today, which was great, but for all the work that we've been able to do together leading up to it, and all of the work that you do through your own organizations. Thanks to everyone for spending time and sending your questions. We will look at all the questions that are there and see if we can find a way to provide any kind of responses. We'll be following up with a link to the recording of the event, and slides and other resources. And, you know, keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
Thank you.